7 wonders of the ancient world. Walk the map today, and exactly one of them is still standing. Of the 6 that are gone, one may never have stood where tradition places it, and none of them vanished quietly or strangely. Every loss has a cause with a name on it, a fire with a year attached, ground that shifted under a paved court, an ordinary reason that nobody at the time thought worth calling strange. Over the next quarter of an hour, we name those causes one at a time, and set beside each the number that rarely gets counted, what the thing cost to raise, and who carried that cost. Line the 7 up that way, and they stop looking like a mystical set. They start looking like an account, with a figure at the bottom. First, though, the list itself. Someone decided there were 7, and decided which 7. Sidon, on the Phoenician coast, around 140 years before our era. A Greek poet named Antipater sets down a short verse listing the places he thinks are worth the crossing. His world has edges you can draw on a map. It runs from Egypt up through Asia Minor, out to Rhodes and Olympia, and east to Mesopotamia, the ground a Greek-speaking traveler could actually reach by ship and road. Everything past that boundary stays off the page. India, the far Atlantic, the whole world north of the Danube go unmentioned, because the short list doubles as an itinerary. The Greek word behind our wonders is theamata, things to be seen, sights. Later copies harden it into thaumata, marvels, though the older sense is plainer, a thing you travel to look at. Holiness is not the entry requirement. Several of these stand inside working sanctuaries, and the test is still whether arriving repays the journey. But no one author owns the 7. Antipater's verse names the walls of Babylon, where later versions put a lighthouse. A treatise credited to Philo of Byzantium words its own selection differently, and the surviving copies quietly disagree. So the canon arrives already argued over, and one entry on it was ancient even then, older by 2,000 years than any Greek who wrote it down. Around 2560 BC, on a plateau of bare limestone west of the Nile, a rope team leans into a single block of 2.5 tons and walks it up a ramp of mud and rubble. They will do that more than 2 million times. What they are raising is older than the Greek list that will one day name it by more than 20 centuries. Finished, it stands 146 meters high, sheathed in polished white limestone, its joints measured in fractions of a millimeter. At sunrise, the whole flank throws the light back down the valley. The hard question was never how they lifted the stone. It was how they fed the men who lifted it, season after season, without the harvest failing. One of their timesheets survives. In a cave at Wadi al-Jarf on the Red Sea coast, papyrus rolls record the rounds of an inspector named Merer in the 27th year of Khufu's reign. His crew rows to Tura, loads casing stone, delivers it to Giza. Below the plateau stood a town built to keep those crews on their feet. Bakeries, breweries, fish brought in by the ton. Bread and beer were wages, issued by measure and written down. So the country was reorganized before it was finished. Each flood season, with the fields underwater, the state had thousands of idle hands, and it had learned to move them, feed them, and count them. The crews knew what they were inside. In a sealed chamber above the burial vault, where no one was meant to look again, a gang painted its own name on the stone, the Friends of Khufu. 2 decades of a kingdom's surplus went into one edge against the sky, and the men who spent it signed the part no visitor would ever see. Giza's bill was paid once, in a single colossal installment. The next 2 entries on the list ran an account that never closed. Olympia, around 435 BC. You come in out of the Greek daylight, and for a moment, the hall of Zeus gives you nothing but dimness. Then the god resolves out of the dark. 12 meters of ivory and gold, seated, his head close under the ceiling beams. Visitors said that if he ever stood up, he would take the roof off. The gold is plate, the ivory is skin, and underneath both there is a wooden core. Wood in a damp river valley moves with the season, and ivory splits. So a shallow pool of olive oil lies in the floor in front of him, and one family at Olympia holds the hereditary right to keep him clean. Their title translates as the burnishers. A statue like this is never finished when its sculptor walks away. It is finished again every season by someone with oil and a cloth paid out of the sanctuary's income. Ephesus, 356 BC. The temple of Artemis burns down to its foundations in a single night. The city rebuilds it larger, on the same marshy platform. Soft ground chosen deliberately because wet soil rides out a tremor better than rock. When Alexander offered to pay for the work, Ephesus turned him down and carried the cost itself. It could afford to. Pilgrims arrived by the thousand for the festivals, and the temple doubled as the safest bank on that coast, holding deposits for cities and private citizens alike. Priests, repairs, festival crowds, a treasury, that is what holds up a wonder made of ivory and marble. All of it rests on people continuing to arrive, which leaves one question hanging over both these buildings. What becomes of an object when the belief that maintained it moves somewhere else? Keep hold of that question. It does get an answer, and the answer is plainer and stranger than you would expect. But 3 other entries have to be sorted out before it makes any sense. 3 that are famous in a way the evidence never quite earned, where what we know parted company long ago from what we keep repeating. Cairo, 353 BC. A provincial ruler named Mausoleum dies, and his widow Artemisia spends the revenue of a whole province on his tomb at Halicarnassus. Here, the ground is firm. Pliny gives dimensions, around 140 feet high, and names 4 sculptors, 1 to a face. He is describing a building still standing as he writes, and it stood for centuries more. The dead man's name became our word for a monumental tomb. Rhodes, 280 BC. Chares of Lindos finishes a bronze sun god some 100 feet tall, paid for by selling the siege engines an enemy army left behind. It stands 54 years. Then an earthquake snaps it at the knees. Oddly, the evidence improves after the collapse. Pliny walked among the pieces and wrote that few men could get their arms around the fallen thumb. That is a measurement. The picture everyone carries is not. The giant astride the harbor mouth, ships gliding between his legs. Nobody who saw it standing describes that pose. Babylon, and here the ground gives way completely. No Babylonian tablet mentions a terraced garden. Herodotus catalogues the city's walls and gates in detail and says nothing of greenery hanging above them. One reading moves the gardens 400 miles north to Nineveh, where an Assyrian king did record terraces watered by a screw. That is an argument, not a verdict. The most painted of the 7 may never have stood where the story puts it. So, one wonder described while it still stood, one measured where it fell, one that may be in the wrong city altogether. In all 3 cases, the fame ran well ahead of the evidence, and it has stayed ahead ever since. What did not outrun the evidence is the ending. How these buildings actually came apart is documented, dated, and far less mysterious than their reputations. Here is the answer owed since Olympia and Ephesus. When belief moves somewhere else, nothing dramatic arrives to finish a building off. The ground simply acquires new owners with other plans, and a temple nobody is paying to maintain becomes the best-stocked stone yard in the district. You brace yourself for catastrophe. The record answers with a work crew and a cart. Earthquakes come first. The eastern Mediterranean sits on live faults, and a tremor of under a minute is enough. You are standing in a paved temple court when the slabs part along a single fissure, dust still hanging in the air after the noise has stopped, and a colonnade 4 centuries old comes down into stacked drums. Fire does the same work faster. Roof beams, scaffolding, the timber of workshops packed against a wall. One night settles it, and stone that is burned crumbles under a hand. Neither of them finishes a building, though. They only make it cheap. A ruined wonder is a stack of dressed stone that somebody else already quarried, squared and hauled to the spot, lying in the open with nobody left to argue over it. So it gets carried away. Marble goes into house walls, door frames, and harbor moles, or into a kiln to be burned down for lime. Metal moves faster still. The broken bronze of the Colossus lay on the ground beside Rhodes Harbor for centuries, until it was sold off and carried away by camel, load after load. Bronze is money from the moment you can lift it. Nobody doing this thinks of himself as a destroyer. He is a mason with a commission, a farmer who needs a lintel, a city that needs its wall closed by spring, and the cheapest good stone in the district is lying in the ruin above the road. Which is why a wonder dies twice. Once as a building, on a dated day, in a tremor or a fire, then again, slowly, as material, block by block, until the ground is clear and the accounts balance. One of the 7 lets you watch that second death from beginning to end. Alexandria, around 280 BC. At the mouth of the harbor, on a low island, a tower rises in 3 stages, a square base, an 8-sided middle, a round crown, and at the top, a fire that is never allowed to go out. You come in from the sea at night, and the light reaches you before the coastline does. Later writers describe a polished mirror throwing it further out. They disagree about how it worked, and nobody has the thing itself. The fire, though, is not in doubt. Ancient descriptions put the tower well over 100 meters, the tallest thing most sailors of that coast would ever see. For something close to 1,000 years, it does a plain job, telling a captain where the sandbanks end and the channel begins. But the ground beneath it keeps no such schedule. An earthquake in 956 takes the first piece off it. Another in 1303 shakes the whole eastern Mediterranean, and a third, 20 years later, brings what is left down to a stump. In 1349, the traveler Ibn Battuta comes back to see it a second time and cannot get in at all. The entrance is blocked, the ruin is closed, and the great mass of it simply lies where it fell. More than a century passes with the rubble still in place. Then, in 1477, the Sultan Qaitbay puts a fortress on that exact footprint, and the stone he needs is already there, dressed, squared, and stacked at his feet. Those walls still stand at the harbor mouth today. Blocks, once cut to lift a fire above the water, now carry a gun platform. The lighthouse never left Alexandria. It changed owners, and it changed jobs. Alexandria's stone changed owners. Giza's, the story goes, never did, the one wonder that outlasted the other 6. But look closely at the base. The pyramid was never spared. It was stripped. In 1303, an earthquake runs through the eastern Mediterranean and shakes the casing loose. Across the river, Cairo is building, and on the plateau lies a mountain of white limestone, already quarried, already dressed, already hauled up the hill by someone else. Carting it off takes generations, and no one records it as vandalism. It is simply the cheapest stone in Egypt. By the time the work stops, the smooth skin is gone, the apex with it, and the pyramid stands some 8 meters shorter than the day it was finished. Inside, the same arithmetic had run its course far earlier. Whatever the chambers held was carried out in antiquity, and what remains in the king's chamber is a lidless granite box, too wide to pass back down the ascending corridor. It stayed because it could not leave. That is the rule the whole plateau obeys. The core runs to something like 2 million blocks, most around 2.5 tons, and moving one across the river costs more in rope, sledges, and men than cutting fresh stone nearby. The quarrying stopped where it stopped paying. 6 wonders were carried away piece by piece. The 7th was only too heavy to carry. You can still stand at its foot because no one could afford to move it. Weigh the 7 one more time. The lightest item in the set survived best. A few lines of Greek, short enough to copy out in an afternoon. Stone needed quarries, crews, and a treasury. The list needed a scribe, ink, and a spare sheet, so it traveled the way cheap things travel. It kept being copied. Into Byzantine libraries, into medieval manuscripts, then into print, each copy outliving the marble it named. In 1572, the engraver Philips Gale published prints of all 7, drawn by Martin van Heemskerk. 6 of them nobody alive had seen. Heemskerk drew them anyway, and Europe took the drawings for a record. From there, the list did real work. It sent travelers to Giza and to the harbor at Rhodes to stand where an entry used to be. Every tower since sold as the 8th wonder is asking to join a shortlist written before it existed. The 6 most expensive objects on the list are gone, and the few words written in praise of them are still being read. The quarrying, the haulage, the seasons of rations. Those bills were settled centuries ago. The one still open is quieter, and it comes due every time someone stands on empty ground and asks what was here. A vague loss keeps nothing. A precise one, when it went, where it stood, who carried the pieces away, stays usable for 1,000 years. That is what the list had been doing all along. Someone judged an ivory haul and a bronze giant worth writing down, years before anyone thought they might vanish. 6 of the 7 are gone. 5 of those losses we can still name. About the garden terraces, historians argue whether they ever stood where the story puts them. That is what the price bought. Attention, held long enough, was the only thing on the list that never needed rebuilding.